APUS government students, here's your exam 2 federalism review. So as we talked about here, focus on those bubbles there in the middle. We're looking at with federalism the idea of we're going to reserve or keep some powers for the states. We're going to share concurrently a few powers between the states and the federal government. We're going to delegate or take certain powers from the states and give them to this new federal government in this Constitution. This entire concept and how this all works is federalism. As we take a step back, there'll be a couple questions on the world systems. As you can recall here, the unitary system, this is where the central government retains all of the trumping power. Most of the world utilizes this system. It's the most popular because it's the easiest. Probably the least popular system is this one here, the confederal system. Most central federal governments, whatever you want to call them, call for, ask for, want more power than just this very severe, limited central power. So we really only looked at a couple of examples of that. And then we began to focus in on our system, how we divide the power between the central federal government and the local state governments. Each has distinct powers. We looked at delegated powers the states cannot have. We also talked about and looked at reserve powers the federal government cannot have. We talked about what's in common about these nations is that by and large they're larger. They're bigger geographical nations. Why federalism? We talked about this. You can review this. But Madison, for that first one there, saw this as, sort of as we talked about checks and balances and separation of powers to divide out the three branches among the three branches of the federal government. This is also looked at as sort of a top-down balance of power or side-by-side balance of power between the states and the federal government. As we focus here on the pros and cons, there'll be a question or two about the stuff there on the left, primarily the first two. Just a question or two reviewing the Federalist number 10, so you can take a look at that there quick. The second one there, the foster the programs for experimentation. We talked briefly about healthcare. We looked more so at the experiment of recreational pot around our country to try and foster new programs that could be utilized for the entire nation. The cons, we talked about those. We kind of foreshadowed that with the second one. States and local governments may lack money and become dependent upon the federal government. So as we talked more about the grant system with that, some states, they'll sign up for whatever, whenever, because they're just so hungry for money that really their ability to say no seems to be kind of gone in this day and age. Plus, we talked about the lack of uniformity of laws in different states. Capital punishment in one state, not capital punishment potentially in another state. As we dove into the three powers now, make sure as we talked about the two different flavors of the delegated powers, enumerated powers expressed obviously, and the implied powers that come from the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause that many of you now know better that come from the McCulloch versus Maryland case. As we moved into our second lecture, we started to talk about reserve powers. So you can see a pretty limited list. Brutus would have hoped for more. We're going to see and talk a lot about the powers within education, and we're going to see here in the coming weeks and months about conducting elections and how the states are free to choose how they conduct their elections and how they vote. The concurrent powers, so you can see primarily the first and third there, the power to tax and the power to establish courts. That's really all you got to know about concurrent powers other than that they are shared between the state and federal government. All right, the big things here from the McCulloch versus Maryland case, you can take a look at this and pause this here to kind of get the gist of, I gave you this example of, what this could have looked like within this case in terms of the percentages and the dollar amounts. Those aren't, completely accurate. But it was trying to give you an example of what this potentially could have looked at and what was happening. The key with this case was 1. You can see there they use a necessary and proper clause for the first time to create implied powers among the federal government. Though it didn't say they had the power to create a bank, they had the power to create the bank through the necessary and proper clause, which created the implied powers for the first time. All right? So even if the federal government, even if the state government could allow, or was forced to allow is what I should say, the federal bank to be there, they, the states, had no power to tax the bank any differently than the state government. The Supremacy Clause is sort of that secondary thing here in this case. Just so you can see the implied powers are just some examples that it creates. You can see then here by the circle me showing you this expansion, this elastic clause, this necessary and proper clause creating these implied powers to give more powers to the federal government. Then we looked at the definition, the Commerce Clause. And the big thing here is that it's a huge, broad authority of power for the federal government. Usually they win on this when they try and use it because commerce is in most everything, interstate commerce that is today. The only example we looked at where they were put in check was the U.S. versus Lopez case. All right, so equal protection, some liberties, 14th Amendment, and federalism here. So you can see we talked about this a little bit, the Civil War. We'll talk a number of times about the 14th Amendment. Don't worry about, completely understanding that quite just yet, but you can see that the states are now going to be forced to follow the Bill of Rights in the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. However, it's not going to be really truly enforced until much after World War II. Dual federalism, the layer cake metaphor, so you can see that there on the left. Fiscal federalism on the right, the marble cake, of which this is really a good example of the marble cake. So focus on B and C there. We talked about the carrots, conditional, strings attached, categorical grants, carrots, all C's there. The block grants are a different kind of carrot, fewer strings attached to be able to get money from the federal government, primarily utilized to foster that experimentation. All right, not really any questions from A, maybe one question from D. Focus on with D, the issue of the unfundedness, the expensive nature of some of these mandates where the states require and want money to do those. Coercion, we then looked at the stick analogy, so you guys can see that. We looked at the 0.08 example. We just mentioned briefly South Dakota versus Dole, which kind of blesses all this stick method stuff. We then looked at Montana's Autobahn as another example, so you can take a look at that. We then had our fun on Friday where we talked about Astorio and Breferin. And then we finished up by looking at the Politics of Federalism. So make sure you have this down and make sure you take a look at that. Okay? Now, not cut and dry, to say that Republicans never used categorical grants. George W. Bush did. And it's not a hard and fast rule that liberals will never support block grants. Certainly they will do that as well. But as we tried to pigeonhole these two groups, this was the best that we could do. And then again, remember to look over and talk with your group about this essay question, the connection central that ties to you talking about what's best for citizens, block grants or categorical grants, and you utilizing Brutus, Federal Number 51, or the 10th Amendment to do that. So stop in and talk to me if you have any questions about this essay. Stop in and talk to me if you got questions about anything dealing with Exam 2. Hoping that you're going to do well. See you soon.